Everyone, welcome to the channel. My name is Becky and this is Brea Makes Art. And today I wanted to share with you some of the failures that I experienced this week, as well as some of the lessons that I've learned from those failures and some tips and tricks that I am using to try to overcome those issues. So first off, I'm just going to kind of talk a little bit about what I was trying to do. And you already know that I failed to do it. I was trying to do one of my most ambitious paintings yet. I wanted to do a realistic painting of water. Now, you can do water pretty simplistically and get it to read as water, and I have done that before and I was relatively happy with it, but I've seen a lot of people do these beautiful realistic paintings of water and I really wanted to do that. So I got myself a gesso board out. It was a little bit bigger than I normally work. This is an 11 by 14 and typically I'm working more at like an 8 by 10 or smaller. Often I'm working in gouache at like more of like a 5 by 7 size, and that is kind of where I'm most comfortable. This is quite a bit bigger. Additionally, I wasn't working in gouache, I was working in acrylics. So I kind of stacked cards against myself here because, like I said, working realistically, which is not something I typically do, or like extra realistically anyway, working in acrylic and working much larger than usual. Now, I wasn't completely stupid. I didn't go into it completely blind. I knew that this was something that I was unfamiliar with, so I did decide to do a little bit of research and watch a couple of YouTube videos and learn about how other people are tackling this sort of thing, tackling painting water realistically. And so I got a lot of great tips and tricks, and that boosted my confidence in order to just go ahead and dive right in. And that was mistake number one. So I got out my gesso board and the first thing I did was put a kind of mid-tone blue all over the panel. And that was great. Not a big problem. That turned out fine. And I tried to kind of look at the picture to figure out, like, are there kind of areas where it was light versus dark? And I could kind of see some areas where it was a little bit lighter here, a little bit darker there. And so I put that in. And then I knew that kind of the next steps would be to kind of put in my shadow shapes and put in my highlight shapes and then kind of work darker from there and work lighter from there so that I could get more of the variations in colors and then kind of put on finishing touches. And I thought this was going to take me a couple of hours and it wouldn't be that bad because overall, when you break it down that simply, it seems pretty easy, pretty straightforward. Unfortunately, then I kind of ran into a couple of issues. Number one, I was having a hard time really trying to pick out where those shadow shapes were. Like, where do I want to draw that? How big is that? Like, what's the actual shape there? And I was focusing in a little bit too much on each of those shapes instead of kind of pulling back, occasionally pulling back to make sure that I had them laid out correctly. And I was just painting them directly on there, thinking that my ability to freehand draw things would translate in to my ability to freehand paint things. That was not the case. So anyway, after probably an hour or more of work, I took a minute and I kind of stepped back and I looked at it and went, wow, this is crap. It did not, like, the shadow shapes just were not where they belonged. I had already put some highlights in there as well, and they just weren't lining up. Like, everything was just kind of out of whack. It was all cattywampus. It was not going to work out. It was going to make it very difficult for me to continue on and be able to feel like I could pull this thing into a realistic painting. So I had to kind of admit defeat at that point. That does not mean that I am trashing this project, however. Instead of trashing the project and just moving on and trying something else, I took a moment to just kind of compose myself and think about, like, okay, what can I do to keep going on this? Because at this point, I was committed because that was going to be my video this week. And if I didn't keep going, I wasn't going to have a video this week. And I didn't have one last week, so I didn't want to not have one this week. So I sat back and kind of put my thinking cap on and thought about this more like the way I think about work. At work, we do kind of projects and we're doing like a large piece of functionality or something like that. And in order to do that, rather than say, here's this big chunk of work, go, we break it down into smaller tasks. We go, okay, cool. We want to make this thing. How can we break that down into small, manageable pieces of work? Great. First, we do this, and then we can do this, and this can happen in parallel, and then we do this, and then we do this, and then we do this, and then we do this stuff to tie it all together, and voila, you've got this big, beautiful, new piece of functionality, and you can divide it up among people, and it's small pieces that you can easily verify that work, etc., etc. It makes it so much easier to tackle and so much less overwhelming to actually do. So I was like, all right, cool. I know how to do this. I do this all the time at work. How can I apply this to my painting? First, I had to figure out, what are my problems? Like, what am I struggling with? Number one, I was struggling with seeing where the shadow shapes were, because the whole reference photo was all blues. And there are some pretty subtle variations in the colors. So where the shadows were versus where it was mid-tone versus where it was a little bit highlighted was kind of hard for me to really see, because I haven't trained myself really well to see that sort of thing. So I was having a hard time kind of picking out where my shadow shapes were. My second issue was I was a little bit overconfident in my ability to just go in and freehand paint all of those shapes on there, and I wasn't taking any time to kind of step back and look at the whole thing to figure out if I was putting things in the right places and if I was putting things like the shapes right or anything like that. I just kind of dove right in and put all my shadow shapes in and started putting some of my highlights in, and then actually kind of stepped back and went, oh, whoops. So after I realized that I had messed this painting up, I decided to start over. What I did is I took my board and I just painted over everything that I had done. I mixed up another mid-tone color and just painted over everything. And then I was like, okay, cool, great. Now I'm back at square one. I've got this nice mid-tone on here. And the nice thing is, when I painted over what I had already done, the paint that I'm using is a little bit transparent, and so I was able to see some of the stuff that I'd already done behind it. And that actually I think is going to work out in my favor, because in water, there's a lot of kind of subtle changes in color, and I think that that's going to kind of lend to that. There's going to be some subtle changes in there that I'm not going to have to go in and paint in again because they're already there. So yay for that. And then I borrowed from some tricks that I have heard other artists do, and I took my reference photo and turned it into black and white and upped the contrast so that I could really see those shadow shapes. So now I've got a black and white, well, not black and white, grayscale map of where my shadow shapes are, and I can kind of see the highlights a little bit better, and I can see the midtones a little bit better. So then I was like, okay, apparently I am not great at kind of freehanding this with a paintbrush, but I do know that I am good at freehanding it like with a pencil. So rather than getting a pencil, I grabbed one of my acrylic markers and I mapped out all of my shadow shapes on my board in acrylic marker. So you can see that here it is kind of in this gray color. It's actually a pretty dark gray, but it turns out looking really light on here because the blue on here is pretty dark. So you can kind of see all of those shadow shapes just kind of drawn on there. And now it kind of looks like a paint by numbers type of painting. And I think this is going to make it a lot easier for me to kind of take the next step. So the next step is to kind of paint in all of those areas in a darker blue. This is kind of a blue-gray color, but you know, it's going to be a darker color. And then I can go in and maybe I will draw out the highlight shapes on here and do the same thing. Maybe after I get these shadow shapes in here, I'm going to feel confident enough to be able to put in the highlights because I will have points of reference. That was one of the things that I found that I was kind of lacking when I was kind of freehand painting in. I didn't have the points of reference because I wasn't kind of referring back to like where this is versus where that should go, and like really like zooming in and out to make sure that I was placing everything correctly. And I definitely did that a lot more when I was drawing this in because I knew that that was a mistake that I had already made. So anyway, I'm going to continue working on this. Unfortunately, you guys aren't going to be able to see the final result in this video, but I will try to make sure to get as much done as I possibly can for next week's video. And I will also try to make sure I'm not getting a video of the back of my head, which is what I had for this one. So even if I had managed to make a pretty good painting, most of what you guys would see would be the back of my head because I had my camera set up in a way that I kept just shoving my head in front of you guys, and that was not going to be any fun for you to watch because you're just going to see my hair. Anyway, I am a little bit discouraged, but I'm not going to let that get me down because I do have a plan to move forward, and I think that it is going to make this much more possible for me to have a successful painting when I'm done. And I think this is a great kind of learning opportunity for me and like a growth opportunity for me to say, hey, you know what, you can do something like this, but you need to take it slow. And you can't just dive in and do it and expect it to come out great. And that's okay. That's okay. Now I know how I need to break something like this down. Now I know that, well, hopefully I will know that this works for me. So anyway, unfortunately, I don't have a finished painting to share with you, and I don't have a lot of footage of what I have already done to share with you because it was mostly footage of the back of my head, which is probably not that exciting to watch. But I am going to continue working on this painting, and I'm going to try to make sure that I'm getting footage of my painting and not my head so that next week you guys can see hopefully a finished painting, if not a lot of great progress on this painting, and I can share with you some more things that I have learned, and hopefully everything that I have shared with you this week is helpful for you. And don't get discouraged. Just know that sometimes you're gonna dive in and you're gonna make a mess of things, and it's okay. Just take a second, take a breath, kind of recoup yourself, and figure out where things went wrong and make a plan to move forward from there. Like I said, sometimes when you have like a big project, you gotta break it down into things. As the old joke goes, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. See you next week.